Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar, AIA 2017 Documents, Revised Architect Scope Documents and Forms, brought to you by AIA Contract Documents. A few administrative items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. It will be uploaded to the AIA Contract Documents Learn page by the end of the week. So if you'd like to view the recording, please visit www.aiacontracts.org/learn. You will receive the PowerPoint at the conclusion of today's program, and this program is also eligible for one AIA learning unit. When you registered for the program, you entered your AIA member number. Your credit will be reported to AIA directly within the next 14 business days. With no further ado, I'd like to hand it over now to our presenter, Mike Koger. Mike?
Thank you very much, Hasi. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this hour-long webinar titled Revised Architect Scope Documents and Forms. Over the next hour, we are going to be talking about 16 new documents that the AIA released in October of this year. That's quite a lot of ground. So we are going to talk about some of those documents in detail, and others we're going to talk about them in a more cursory fashion, just depending on which documents have more importance or more use and have had more revisions over the last 10 years or so. This presentation is primarily geared towards architects. When we're talking about architect scope documents, we are going to be talking about documents that an architect can use to attach to an owner-architect agreement to expand some of their basic services. But when we get towards the end of this presentation, we're going to be talking about our G-Series forms, and that is going to really touch on all areas of the construction industry, and it will be important for architects, along with owners and contractors and other and anyone involved in the construction industry, to pay attention to that part. Just a quick aside, if you have been paying attention to the documents that the AIA has released for the entirety of 2017, I'm not going to be talking too much about the spring release of documents, which includes 14 documents that were our primary design bid build documents. This is the second piece of the 2017 release, and we're going to be focusing on just these scope documents and forms. If you want more information about the spring release, please go to our website, and there's plenty of webinars on there about changes to the A201 and so on and so forth. A couple of legal notes here. This presentation is protected by copyright laws. If you are, please don't copy it unless you have permission. Also, this presentation, as Hasti mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, it is registered with the AIA for continuing education credits. If you have any questions about that, please shoot us an email or contact us. As for myself, my name is Mike Koger. I am a senior manager and counsel with the AIA Contract Documents team. I started off my career as an architect and worked for about 4 or 5 years in architecture in Southern California, mostly started off doing some residential work, but then eventually found my way towards doing industrial IT tech heavy architecture and design. And then eventually switched my career path and to the legal side of the profession. And after law school, I practiced in Southern California and in Washington, D.C., doing litigation for about the first 4 or 5 years of my career. And interestingly enough, although I am an architect, I mostly represented contractors and owners my first handful of years doing litigation, and did not find myself representing a lot of architects during that time. It's just something of a quirk of the places that I worked. So I feel like I've got a little bit of perspective on all sides of the construction industry, but I think at heart I am an architect, and throughout this presentation you will probably see that come out. The last 4.5 years or so I have worked with the AIA and worked closely with the AIA Contract Documents Committee and the other advisors that we have that work with the committee to revise and update the AIA contract documents and to research legal issues that pertain to our AIA documents that we offer. And with that, I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about the history of the AIA contract documents and how we go about making our documents. I think a lot of times people that use our documents that aren't familiar with our program think that they are created by one person sitting in Washington, D.C., by one attorney. That's not the case. It is a very collaborative effort. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background about that before we start talking about our fall release of documents. The AIA has been creating standard form documents since the late 1800s. Even before that, we were providing industry input to architects about contractual matters. We started off, our first contract we created was a owner-contractor agreement. We created our first general conditions for a construction contract in the early 1900s, and of course have been creating documents ever since. One of the unique things about our documents is that, and the history of our program is that our documents and our program have really evolved over time. So as the construction industry has adopted new practices, has adopted new ways to carry out projects, our documents have evolved right along with it. So nowadays we offer almost 200 documents, anything from design bid build to an entire set of design build documents, construction manager documents, IPD documents, and so on. That is a very long way of saying before you start drafting up a contract or having your attorney draft up a contract from scratch, you might want to look at the AIA's offerings because there's a pretty good chance that we offer something that could be of use to you. And I know a lot of times that happens, that people get all the way through creating a contract and then they realize, oh, the AIA's already got something that could get them started. The AIA has been creating documents so long that we have quite a substantial volume of interpretive case law. And what that means is that courts all over the country have interpreted our documents over time. And if you have a question about, for example, what some section of A201 means, there's a very good chance that a court in your jurisdiction has actually interpreted that document or that particular language. So you can go to the AIA Legal Citator, and very often you can find a case in which a court, that has precedence over your particular dispute, has actually rendered a decision on a piece of language, and that's very helpful in avoiding disputes and for resolving disputes quickly if you already know what a court in your jurisdiction is going to say about a particular piece of contract language that you've entered into. When we create documents, we try and be the industry standard. We try to be fair and balanced, and we try to create documents that are fair to all parties. If we're drafting a owner-contractor agreement, we want a document that's fair to both parties. It is really, we do not try to create documents that in some way shift risk in a manner that is not fair to the parties. That's something that attorneys will do. If you hire an attorney, they might attempt to do that for you. But when you pick up an AIA document, the goal is, and we hope that you will be, when you read it, you will see that this document is something that is fair amongst both contracting parties. We take a very painstaking process to create our documents. Sometimes it takes us anywhere from a year to 2 years to create a document or to revise some of our more substantial documents. One of the first things that we do is we look at legal decisions all over the country to see if a court, somewhere in the country has made a decision about our documents that we might need to address in a future iteration of that document. We also seek significant input from the industry. If we are doing, for example, creating a document about geotechnical engineering, which we did in 2015, we're going to reach out to the geotechnical engineering community and to experts in that field to get their thoughts on our documents and to get their input. We go through a very substantial draft and revision process, and it is almost like creating legislation with as much input as we get and as much consideration as goes into the comments that we receive from the community. I know we have a lot of people that are listening to this webinar today, and there is a very good chance that somebody that is listening to this webinar has given us comments on our documents in the past. And then, of course, finally, we publish those documents, and we still get feedback from them even after they've been published, and we consider those for the next iteration of our documents. Like I said, our work with the AIA contract documents could not exist without our AIA Contract Documents Committee. We work with, I am, like I said, a staff attorney at the AIA, but I work with anywhere from 30 to 35 volunteer AIA members. These are architects who are, in good standing with the AIA. They tend to be principals, partners of their firm. They are people who are they're volunteer members, and they are very involved with contracting in their respective firms. And they give us they really are the heart of our documents program, and they give us all the feedback, and they give us all of the real life, examples of what's going on in the construction industry to help guide our documents. The AIA Contract Documents Committee members, they sign up for a 10-year commitment, and they sign up for that long of a commitment to work with this committee because we revise our documents every 10 years, especially for our major families of documents. So we like to have that continuity. It is like I said, it is a huge commitment for our committee members to do this work. They meet with us twice a year in Washington, D.C., and they also meet with us around the country to help us do our work with the AIA contract documents. So today, while all of the documents that we're going to be talking about, I've had some involvement with, you can also believe that there's been quite a few of our documents committee members who have done as much or more work than I have on these documents to create them. So, and the map that you see on the screen here shows where all of our committee members reside and where they work. And while they're all architects, they all work in different realms of the construction industry. Some work for owners, some work for contractors and for construction management companies. So with that background in mind, let's move to the 2017 release. This year has been a very big year for our contract documents program. This year, like I mentioned before, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 documents that we offer. We have released 30 revised or new documents this year. And that is because, as I mentioned, we revise documents on a 10-year schedule, and the 7th year of every decade is when we revise our design bid build documents. And our design bid build documents are still the most popular documents that we offer. And so in the spring, we released a number of our core design bid build documents, including things like the A201. We created a new insurance exhibit for our owner contractor agreements that is state of the art, and it was a pretty good overhaul from 10 years ago. And also we created a new sustainability exhibit. This is something that is relatively new to our program that you can attach to your agreements to make for sustainability obligations for a contractor, for a architect, and so on. So the screen that I'm showing right now is all of the 2017 spring release documents. This is all I'm going to be talking about, those documents. Like I said, if you want more information about them, please go on to our website, and there's an abundance of writings, of webinars, of information about these design bid build documents. So without further ado, these are the documents, the fall release documents that we're going to be talking about today. The first batch of documents is the scopes, and I'm going to be talking about every single one of these in some detail except for B201. B201, Design and Construction Contract Administration, is very similar to what you would find in a B101 owner-architect agreement. So if you want to know about that document, go look at one of the B101 owner-architect webinars. We have at least one, if not more than that, of those out there. I won't be talking about that one in detail, but I will be talking about the rest of these scopes. And then the forms, I'm going to be talking about a handful of these forms. I'm going to talk about G701, our change order form. I'm also going to talk about G704, our certificate of substantial completion. And then I will also talk about G801 and 802, which are respectively the notice of additional services and the amendment to the professional services agreement. All of those documents have changed in some significant way. The remainder of these documents have not really changed in a huge way. There are some nuances to each of them, but we only have so much time, so I'm not going to be able to go over all of those documents. But most of them you can, if I'm not mentioning them today, they probably are a very little used document, or they probably have not had a tremendous amount of edits over the last, in this 2017 iteration. So let's go ahead and talk about scope documents. First thing we need to figure out is, what is a scope document? I know a lot of people are a little bit confused by that concept, but it is really a concept that is a set of documents that we've created. We started creating them at least 10 years ago, but it is born out of this idea that architects do more than traditional basic architectural services. And if you look at our B101 documents, and I hope most of the architects that are listening to this webinar are somewhat familiar with B101. It's broken up into basic services, and then, at least now, it is broken up from basic services to supplemental and additional services. I think basic services include things like schematic design, design development, CDs, construction administration work. This is the kind of services that you are going to perform on every project, the basic design services. But Article 4 talks about supplemental services. These are all the extras that an architect can do and should be getting paid for. And these are things like doing programming work. It is not a given that an architect does programming. That is something that an architect can certainly do, but it is something that an architect probably should be getting paid an extra fee for. And if you look at our B101, that's exactly how it is set up. So here is I believe this is a comprehensive list of our scope documents that we offer. The ones in red on the screen are the ones that have been revised this year, and that I'm going to talk about today. But keep in mind, we offer quite a lot of other scope documents that you can add to an owner-architect agreement if you're doing that type of work. For example, we have a regional and urban planning document. We have a LEED certification document. Now, if you look at the dates for those documents, you'll notice that they were, the regional and urban planning document was created in 2010, so we'll probably be revising that in 2020. And the LEED document was created just 5 years ago, so we will not be revising that for probably another 5 years unless there's a real need. But the ones that we created, that we have revised this year, we're all due for a 10-year revision. And so that's why we're going to be talking about those today. So how do you use scope documents? I've had quite a few architects ask me over time, how do you use these B200 series scope documents? There's really two different ways. And the first involves the use of our B102, which is a owner-architect agreement that has no predefined scope of services. And what that means is that B102 is an agreement that has all of the business terms that an architect is going to need in order to have an agreement with an owner. Things like payment provisions, copyright and licenses for the architect's instruments of service. It's going to have termination provisions, and it's going to have dispute resolution provisions. But when it comes to the scope of work that the architect is going to perform, B102 just has a prompt for the parties to add whatever that scope of services is. So you can add all of those, or reference all of the B200 series documents through B102. So in order to have a full agreement for, let's say if you're starting a project and you want to do programming for an owner, you would take B102, fill that out, and then reference B202, which, if you saw from the last slide, is the programming scope. And then as that project advances on and you are going to do perhaps historic preservation services, you might add B205, which is the historic preservation scope that we'll talk about in a minute. The other way to do this is if you start with a owner-architect agreement that has a scope of services already included, like B101 has your, what we'll call traditional basic architectural services, and then you can add on to that as you see fit, either by referencing the 200 series scopes at the time of contracting or amending that owner-architect agreement. So it is a modular way of contracting. You can add scopes on as as you see fit for your particular project. So I'm going to start first by talking about, the first document I'm going to talk about is B203, which is a document titled Site Evaluation and Project Feasibility. If you are familiar with this document from 2007, it was actually titled Site Evaluation and Planning. And we took a close look at this document over the last few years and realized that it really is not a planning document. It is more of a site evaluation and feasibility document. And I think most architects have been in the scenario where you are working with an owner who's either selecting a site or trying to pick a site. If they've got a couple of different sites in mind that they're looking to purchase or that they already own and they're looking for which site is more appropriate for their project, or they already own a piece of land and they're trying to figure out, well, what can I build here? They might not even have a project exactly in mind. They're just trying to figure out, what is even feasible on this particular piece of land that I have. And the B203 is geared toward that kind of answering those kinds of questions. And frankly, this is the kind of service, these are kind of services that architects quite often do for free, and they do them just to get the job. But if you use the B203, this is a scope that you can put in front of an owner and say, these are the things I'm going to do for you. I'm going to evaluate things like the utilities and a buildable square footage on that site, and use that as a basis for starting the contracting with the owner and getting paid a fee for that kind of pre-design work. I know when I used to do design work out in California, one of the most common questions we would get from homeowners is, I have this piece of land, what can we do with it? They might not even know what they want, but what can we do with it? And this is the scope that you would use to answer that question. And because project feasibility and site evaluation is it's very much a project-specific set of services, we've created this document as a menu of services. So there's no set standard of services here. You really need to go through the matrix that is in this scope and select the services that are appropriate. And it goes anything from doing a basic site evaluation to identifying context items that are around the site, to doing a historic resource inventory, all the way to doing conceptual drawings, kind of a preliminary design conceptual drawings. And it just depends on what your owner needs and depends on your capabilities as an architect, what you might check off there. And of course, while I'm showing on my screen here a schedule of services, the way this is supposed to work is you will check off, or insert, who's responsible for this. And then there are more further descriptions of these services further on in the document. I'm just not showing it on my screen because that's way too much text. The next document that we offer or that we revised in 2017 is our historic preservation document. And anyone who's done work on a project that has historic significance knows that there is a heck of a lot more skill and nuanced skill that goes into designing on a building with historic significance. There are code issues, there are state and local restrictions. It's much more higher regulatory oversight and environmental issues that come into working on a project with historical significance. And a lot of times, architects will, sign a traditional B101 and do all of these services as included in their basic architectural services. Well, you are doing a lot more work on a project with historic significance. So I think it's a very good idea to, show this B205 and the services in it to an owner and say, here are all the kinds of things that I might have to do on your project, and get paid for those extra services. If you are, doing things like, going to public hearings and those kind of things for historic preservation, you should be getting paid for those kinds of things as additional to your traditional design work. We updated this document in 2017. We did not do a huge overhaul of the services that are in it. We did make quite a few substantial changes. But the document is largely as it was in 2007. The big thing that we did, though, was we reorganized it in a manner that was more chronological and that made more sense because the 2007 version of this document was really just a smattering of services that weren't particularly organized. So we did a lot of organizational work on this document. And what we did was break it up into 4 different categories of services. The first is a few services that go towards historic assessment. Quite often when you're working on a project with historic significance, either the owner is going to require you to research the history, or more likely your local government or your state is going to require you to research the history and provide a building or history chronology of that building, as part of, if you're going to be doing any redevelopment of that project or of that site. And so we have a handful of services, for historic assessment that an architect can perform. The next category of services is doing an existing building assessment. And this is really the nuts and bolts of going into a historic building and doing a code review, doing a structural investigation, and maybe even doing exploratory demolition to figure out what concealed conditions might be of that historic building. It can include anything, including things like paint analysis. I mean, so you can see how this can get fairly complicated, and you can see how this requires a specialized skill set for an architect. And also the architect might need to be hiring consultants as well. If you're doing a structural investigation, very good idea for an architect to get a structural engineer in there to do that kind of work. Again, this document is set up as a menu of services because not all of these are going to apply. It's probably going to be very rare that all of the services in the V205 would apply to every project. But you'll have to have a conversation with an owner, while executing this agreement to figure out which services you're going to provide and which you're not going to provide. The next set of services is preservation planning. And this is really preliminary design services. Quite often when an owner is engaging an architect to, review and, and to evaluate an existing building, they're doing it because they want to maybe add on to that project, or they want to, see if they can, renovate the building for a new use or something. So the preservation planning services really tap into that idea of doing preliminary design, but it goes just beyond mere design. It could include things like, assisting the owner in putting forward proposals for grants, creating preservation guidelines that a contractor eventually may have to follow, and those kinds of things. And lastly, it should come as no surprise that there is a lot of state and federal regulation over properties with historic significance, and there are a number of services in there that you can select for the architect to assist in, seeking tax incentives, or to nominate a building for a National Register of Historic Places and so on. So there's opportunities for an architect to do those kinds of things with the B205 as well. The next document that we updated is B207, on-site project representation. If you are familiar with our B101 document and the majority of our owner architect documents, they require the architect during the construction phase to visit the site at periodic intervals, depending on what is going on at the project at that time. And that might mean that an architect goes to the project and visits the site every 2 weeks. It might mean every month, just depending on what's going on. But sometimes a project is of such complexity, or it is of such size, and it is so fast-paced that an owner may want the architect to have a representative at the site at all times, or at much more than what periodic site visits would entail. In the past, we've called this person a clerk of the works. That term has gone out of style, as that at least traditionally has brought forth connotations of the architect or the representative doing oversight or real having some kind of a supervisory role over the contractor. Of course, that's no longer the case, so we just call this person an on-site project representative. I can think of only one time in my, one or two times in my career where I've worked on a project that has had an on-site project rep, and that is was a large casino project in Southern California. So of course, that's the kind of project, it's huge, complex, and it's very fast-paced. And there's a lot of money at stake for delays. So of course that makes sense for someone to be on site. So what are the advantages of having an on-site project representative? You're going to get faster resolution of RFIs and submittals, payment applications. You're going to have better project management and better record keeping and documentation from the architect's perspective. And the architect is going to just be better tapped into what is going on the project on a daily basis. So here are some of the services, just a quick overview of some of the services that are in that B207 document. The first thing that the on-site project representative has the authority to do and will be performing are all of the construction administration services in the underlying owner-architect agreement. Now, that's only one line in this entire document referencing back to whatever the underlying owner-architect agreement is, but that's a lot of work. If you're thinking about imagine a complex project, you're talking about RFIs that are happening almost daily, submittals that can be pretty daunting to review, and reviewing payment applications that can be pretty complex as well. All of those things are going to be things that this on-site project rep can do and should be doing as part of their work. They're also going, in addition to that, this on-site rep is going to be attending meetings and observing tests and inspections, and observing materials, equipment, workforce, and weather conditions. Those kinds of things can be very important when it comes time for the architect to certify payment applications that the contractor has submitted, that they actually are on the site to see what kind of labor force has been on and what kind of work has been done and what kind of equipment and materials are stored on site. So that's a big benefit to an owner to really have more accuracy and better attention paid to those kind of things by an on-site project representative. This representative also has responsibilities to review the contractor's documentation and schedule, and also to create a daily log of activities and monthly progress reports. And I'm not going to get into too much of the detail of what goes into those items, but the log is going to be where this representative, identifies work that's performed and conditions that might delay the project. And the monthly progress report is where where the representative gives an update to the owner on things like submittals, schedules, change orders, and CCDs, and on non-conforming work. And I can think of at least one case that I worked on when I was doing litigation where monthly reports like this were a huge value to a client that I had as an owner who was trying to go back and prove up a case against a contractor that had, that had built some pretty, had quite a few construction defects that led into a lot of water infiltration and water issues on this project. So those kinds of things can be very helpful in keeping an eye on the project, but also can be helpful in asserting claims later on. The next document that we're going to talk about is our B210 facility support scope. This is a document that we really drastically updated in 2017. It is a document which envisions the architect as a strategic partner to an owner in facility management. and in space planning for a number of facilities. If you can imagine an owner who has a real estate portfolio of offices, maybe 5 to 10 office buildings in a same city, the owner has to manage space within those buildings and decide, do they need to build more office space? Do they need to lease more office space? Or can they be more efficient in their use of their existing space? Well, the B210 facility support scope imagines the architect as somebody who is that strategic partner to the owner, who can be a consultant to the owner in making those kinds of decisions. And this is somewhat thing where we really do see the industry moving, and that architects are telling us they want to do this kind of work. They want to be more of a strategic consultant to an owner rather than just a consultant who carries out projects. So this is we have tried to be responsive to those needs for architects in providing this facility support scope. This document itself has quite a lot of services in it. It's also set up as a menu of services because no architect could probably perform all of these services, and you're probably not going to have any particular project or engagement where you're going to be doing all of these at the same time. But you might be doing some of these services on one facility and then doing other services on another facility. But here are the main categories of services in this facility support scope. First is a facility condition assessment. And this is a visual assessment that an architect is going to be doing on various components of the work of an existing facility, like the interior or exterior or MEP systems. And it requires the architect to do a visual assessment and describe conditions of existing conditions, estimate the useful life of different components, identify deficiencies, and include recommendations to the owner. Now, this is something that for each facility, it might not be done quite often. It might be done once every 10 years or so, but it is often the starting point of an architect's engagement in a facility support role. Secondly, an architect there can do facility performance assessment of a facility, which can include things like evaluating and assessing the operating costs of the facility and looking at the building automation systems and providing an evaluation of work space ergonomics, of the sustainability of an existing facility, and on health and wellness of the facility as well. Operations assessment is where the architect will take a look at things like vendor contracts for operations and maintenance, and evaluate labor costs and help the owner evaluate those kinds of things to make sure that those are running as efficiently as they can. Another interesting category of services that an architect can provide here is space management, and that's doing things like workplace strategies, migration planning, and occupancy planning. I think architects can really provide value to owners in this area because they can, instead of just evaluating and creating new projects and adding on square footage to an owner's portfolio, an architect is very well situated and has the skills to evaluate, can we do more with the existing facilities that we have? Can we be more efficient with our space? And that is something that a lot of, in particular, the corporate offices are, and corporate office planning are really looking at nowadays, is how can we be more strategic in our approach to space planning in offices. So again, this is a real high overview of the services that are included in these documents, and they're pretty. There's a lot of detail in these documents, and I really can only give a couple of minutes of detail into each one of them. The last scope that we are going to talk about right today is the C203 commissioning scope. And if you are paying attention to our nomenclature and the way that we name and number our documents, you will notice that this is the only document that we're talking about today that has a C in front of it. All of the other documents are B documents, which means they are owner-architect agreements and owner-architect scopes. This commissioning scope is in the C series because it is a consultant scope of services. If you are familiar with our previous commissioning scope, you'll know that it was titled B211, 2007, and it was titled Standard Form of Architect Services Commissioning. Well, we've done quite a lot of soul searching at our own documents committee meetings, and we really realized that while architects can do commissioning services, this is not the realm in which architects are dominating the industry. I mean, most often you have MEP engineers who are doing commissioning. You have people from all kinds of backgrounds who are doing commissioning work, and so when we revised this commissioning scope, we actually took that into account and we turned it into a consultant's scope of services. Now, of course, an architect can still do these services, but it would just be, using this C203 scope to do it. And of course, you should be attaching this document. If you're going to be using this scope, you should be attaching it to our C103, which is an owner consultant agreement, which is our base owner consultant agreement. You put those two documents together to create a full integrated agreement. So what is commissioning? Commissioning is a quality-focused process to verify and document that a building's systems and assemblies are installed, tested, operated, and maintained to meet the owner's project requirements and the design intent. And commissioning is something that really benefits of commissioning are things that are sort of becoming well known. It optimizes energy use. Commissioning can reduce operating costs, and they can also ensure the training of operations and maintenance personnel. Some of the trends that we've seen in commissioning include earlier engagement of the commissioning provider. I think 10 to 15 years ago, it was pretty common for a commissioning provider to come on towards the very end of the project and commission the project at that point. Now, all of the best practices guides and we've seen, and industry practice has suggested that the commissioning provider come on to the project during the design phase and actually, review the design at appropriate intervals. Another thing that we have noticed as a trend in the commissioning realm is that commissioning has become more prevalent as green codes have become adopted, as things like LEED and other sustainability certification programs have become more prevalent. Most, if not all of them, have required commissioning as a prerequisite towards achieving those codes or towards achieving a certification. And we've seen more and more buildings undergo commissioning as part of their design and construction process. So I'll just go through some of the features of the C203 document. One of the things that always comes up when you're talking about commissioning is, should the commissioning provider be an independent entity to the design team and the construction team? All of the industry standard best practices organizations will almost unanimously say that yes, this commissioning provider should be someone who is independent of the design team and the construction team. Both of the LEED fundamental and in their enhanced credits do require independence of the commissioning provider. There is an exception though, that for projects that are under, I think, 20,000 square feet, the fundamental credit for LEED can still be achieved by having the design team or someone from the construction team provide the commissioning. The C203's solution does, of course, require independence as well, unless there is informed written consent. This means that if a member of the design or construction teams are going to be providing commissioning, that means not only do they have to get written consent, but they actually have to tell the owner what that means. And that means you have to have a conversation with the owner that goes along the lines of, you know, not only are we going to be performing the work, we're going to be performing the construction work, we're also going to be doing the testing to verify that it's been done correctly. I think a lot of times owners would see the inherent conflict of interest in such an endeavor. The C-203 requires the parties to include a number of items of initial information in Article 1. The parties should be identifying the systems and assemblies to be commissioned, should be identifying the subconsultants and the owner's contractors and consultants so that those are known at the time of contracting. And owners really need to be identifying the contractors and consultants that they are going to be hiring in this separate contractors and consultants that they're going to be hiring, because the commissioning provider is going to be working with those parties throughout design and throughout the construction. The first phase of the C-203's commissioning planning services includes an initial coordination meeting, and it requires the commissioning provider to assist the owner in the owner's project requirements. The owner's project requirements is a fundamental document in commissioning, and it is a document that identifies systems and assemblies to be commissioned, and it defines the owner's goals for each, and including things like functional expectations, performance criteria met by the design, and sustainable objectives to be achieved. And so if the owner already has that document, when they engage the commissioning provider is going to be reviewing it. But if they have not, then the commissioning provider will assist in the creation of that document. Also in the planning services, the commissioning provider is going to be reviewing the design team's basis of design and then ultimately creating a commissioning plan. And the commissioning plan is another fundamental document in the commissioning process. And this is a place where the commissioning provider commits to writing all of the commissioning activities and documentation that are going to be required through the project, and protocols for design and submittal reviews, as well as protocols for contractor documentation. And this commissioning plan is important because if you don't have the commissioning plan, and if you do not include that in the owner-contractor agreement, there really is nothing to tie and to require the contractor to commission the project, to commission the building. So you want to be including this commissioning plan as part of the owner-contractor agreement, as part of the contract documents that the contractor is required to abide by. During the design phase, there should be, the commissioning provider is going to be doing commissioning design reviews, and also providing their own commissioning specifications, which should be coordinated with the architect's specifications. Those will also be included in the owner-contractor documents. The commissioning provider also has a number of responsibilities for performing work during the construction phase services. I'm not going to go into all of those here, but you know, they'll be doing things like creating an issues log, and they'll be doing other things like you know, attending site visits and observing and documenting functional performance tests, as well as creating construction checklists that an owner's contractor can use to verify the materials and components are on site, ready for installation, and correctly installed. Lastly, the C-203 has a phase of services for documentation and training, and that includes responsibilities of the commissioning provider to create a systems manual and to assist in operator training, as well as to create a commissioning report of all of the commissioning activities that have taken place. I also should point out that C-203 does not include as basic services occupant training. It's It's going to be including training for operations and maintenance personnel, but not for the building occupants themselves. It doesn't include things like ongoing commissioning or seasonal and deferred functional testing. Those are all things that can be very important to the commissioning process, but they are not included in the basic service of the commissioning provider. If the commissioning provider is going to do those kinds of things, you'll need to add them on as additional or supplemental services. So with that, I'm going to take the last 10 minutes or so of this presentation and talk about the 2017 forms. And I'm going to talk about the G701 change order, G704 certificate of substantial completion, and then the G801 and 802 amendment documents for owner-architect agreements. First, I think most people in the construction industry are familiar with what a change order is. It is a written instrument provided by the architect and signed by the owner, contractor, and architect, stating their agreement upon changes in the work, the amount of adjustment of the contract sum, and the extent of the adjustment of the contract time. One thing that people sometimes get confused in is they think that there can be, or that an architect's work or an architect's scope of work is changed by a change order. That's not the case. A change order is solely a mechanism by which an owner and contractor's agreement is changed. Either work is added or subtracted. When you were talking about adding or subtracting work from an architect's scope or from an architect's agreement, you're talking about doing an amendment or an amendment for additional services. Just one point of clarification there. So given that, why does an architect sign a change order? Well, quite often change orders impact an architect's instrument of services. There can be code implications, there can be health, safety, and welfare implications anytime a change order is executed in which work's been added or subtracted from a project. So an architect needs to be involved in that process. So here's what our old G701 used to look like. Now we haven't made a tremendous amount of changes substantively to this document, but I'm going to use this document to show you what we have, some of the changes that we have made to all of our G-Series forms. First, the title block itself was very inconsistent amongst all of our G-Series forms. It takes up a lot of space, and it also is somewhat unorganized. We also talked with quite a lot of people and realized that many people did not understand what these handful of checkboxes are on the right-hand side of this document. People were confused by that, and they also, it really is a relic of a time when people handed out paper documents. An architect would go to the field and have a box checked off for an owner, and well, here's your version of a change order, and hand one to the contractor. So we did away with that checkbox system, given that most documents are passed back and forth digitally nowadays, and there was really no indication that people were using those checkboxes. We also did a few edits to the address, to the title block, or the signature blocks at the very bottom of the sheet. There's no real need to have an address there for each party. So here is what the new G701 2017 looks like. You can see we've simplified the information block at the very top. We've included a place where the owner, architect, and contractor can put their name and address and contact information. We do not have a specific architect's project number anymore, but you can certainly include that in the fill point under architect. Just like you can include the project number for the owner and contractor underneath their respective fill points. Next, I'll talk a little bit about the G704 Certificate of Substantial Completion. This slide, I'm not going to read it. It is way too dense, but this is quoting from our A201 section that includes a good amount of detail about what substantial completion is and what needs to go into the certificate of substantial completion. And this is a reminder that all of our G-Series forms tie back to our owner-contractor or owner-architect agreement. So when you're filling out a certificate of substantial completion, really what you're doing is you are filling out all of that in the context of your underlying owner-architect or owner-contractor agreement. So the A201 says that a certificate of substantial completion has to include the date of substantial completion. It also has to include things like the responsibilities for utilities after substantial completion. It also has to include the owner and contractor's signature in order to accept the responsibilities in that certificate of substantial completion. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what the old G704 used to look like. One of the things that we received quite a lot of complaints about over the years was the first sentence was a bit awkward, and people were confused by exactly what is supposed to be included in that first fill point. We also had a lot of people ask us about the warranty fill point. Now, the warranties in our A201 states that warranties start upon substantial completion unless they have been specifically identified elsewhere. Now, it says that in the body of this G704 document, but quite a few people they wanted to put something in this warranty fill point, even when they didn't really want to change the date of when warranty started. So there was a bit of confusion as to what people should fill in here. In most cases, you really should not be filling in anything in here unless you wanted warranties to start at a different time other than substantial completion. There was also some language in this document that did not coordinate well with A201. For example, the G704 says that there should be a cost estimate of the work that is incomplete or defective. Well, the A201 does not use that language, so we've modified that. And also there are signatures for the contractor and for the owner, but they come at kind of odd places in this document. So the new G704 looks a little bit different. You can see that warranties have been broken out. You can see that into their own separate section. And you can also see that instead of saying cost estimate of the work that is incomplete or defective, it says cost estimate of work to be completed or corrected, which is more in line with the language of A201. And also the contractor and owner signatures come at the bottom of the document after the responsibilities that they are taking on. And we are now getting towards the end of the hour, and I know we're not going to have time to get to the last two forms that I was hoping to talk about. But I do want to make sure that I turn this back over to Hasi. I know she has a few comments about to kind of wrap things up. Hasi?
Mike, thank you so much for that thorough and excellent presentation. I do want to just emphasize that I will be sending the PowerPoint along to attendees. I've also uploaded it currently in your GoToWebinar handout section, but you will receive an email with the recording as well. So stay tuned for that. Mike, we have about 2 minutes left. There are a few questions that have come in that I'd like to spend the remainder of the time answering.
Sure.
So first is first. And any questions we can't get to today, we can follow up with, but which documents might apply to Disabled Access Consulting, ADA?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think our facility support document could certainly work. There are some things that are included in there, like a facility, a condition assessment. And of course, when you're looking at a building that's, already exists, if it is older than 25 years or so, there's a very good chance that you have ADA issues. Aside from that, that's probably the best one.
Great. Is B205 2017 only for actual historic buildings or any existing building that is to be renovated?
Good question. Of course, it's titled Historic Preservation, but And many of the services there that are included in it are specific to buildings that have some kind of a state or local or federal designation. But you could use many of the services in there on just an existing building. For example, that scope also has services for doing, a structural assessment. That's going to apply regardless of whether or not that building has some kind of designation as being historic, or if it's just a building that's, 15 years old and, has no historic significance. So many of the services in there can be used on any property.
Great. The B210 2017 facility support, is this a standalone document versus augmentation to an owner-architect agreement?
Another very good question. You can certainly imagine a scenario in which you would add that facility support scope onto an existing owner-architect agreement. For example, if you were the architect of record for a facility that eventually needed space planning, off into the future. But in many instances, I suspect an architect will want to do those services and be engaged as a consultant as a standalone kind of agreement. So you can take B210, add that to B201, and have a standalone agreement for services. It really just depends on the nature of your relationship and what kind of, other services you're going to be providing for the owner.
Okay, and that's unfortunately all the time we have today. Again, I will be emailing you the PowerPoint from today's presentation. The recording will be uploaded to our webpage, aiacontracts.org/learn. And I will be reporting credit within the next 2 weeks for this webinar. This is eligible for 1 AIA learning unit. Any questions regarding content, please don't hesitate to contact docinfo@aia.org, docinfo@aia.org. Mike, again, thank you for a very thorough and thoughtful presentation. We all hope that the attendees today enjoyed, and we look forward to receiving any follow-up questions from today's webinar. Thank you so much.